think we're at 5 minutes past. I think let's get going. Seize the day. Thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see so many people here. I'm Percy, or Persephone, and I'm a freelance creative practitioner based in Brighton, and I've co-organised this event with Amy, who's a director at Onca, it's an art and environment organisation in Brighton, and Polly, who's a creative practitioner and producer based in Hastings, and together we run the CDE Southeast Coastal Hub. And we are working towards hosting our first large event on April the 22nd. Going to be a cultural assembly at the Delaware Pavilion in Bexhill. And in the lead up to that event, we wanted to have an online offer to kind of get people's imaginations engaged and get people thinking about themes, and see if, and just generally kind of put out the invitation there to think about coming to the cultural assembly. And really much of our work is focused on these two themes of climate justice and eco-emotions. So that's what the assembly will be bridging, and that's what today's event focuses on too. So yeah, we're going to be exploring ways to overcome eco-anxiety, or sit with it and activate our power to fight for climate justice. And today's session is inspired by the question, what is enough? What's enough money, enough stuff, enough time, what's enough impact? And questions like this can be quite overwhelming and create blocks to taking action. So we've got these two amazing guest speakers today who've been dedicated a lot of their time and energy to thinking through these blocks and facing them creatively. So we'll hear from them, and then also we'll be able to ask them questions and respond to their presentations, and we'll talk in breakout rooms about the two presentations and then feedback at the end. So yeah, that's it really. We'll talk more about the cultural assembly again. I'll show you the picture, share the link, and really invite you to share that with your networks and book your places there. But before then, let me introduce our first speaker, Perpetua Kirby. Welcome and thank you so much for coming. Really excited about your presentation. Perpetua is a lecturer in childhood and youth in the School of Education and Social Work at University of Sussex. Perpetua's research interests are children and people's rights, participation and agency, and she writes about education for sustainability and teaching for climate change. So Perpetua, over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for inviting me today. It's really, really lovely to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. And so I'm going to be talking about work that I do with my colleague Rebecca Webb, who's also at Sussex. And so this is a sort of joint presentation that I'm here for both of us. And we do a lot of work thinking about how do we educate for sustainability and climate change. And we work with colleagues across the university, including a lot of life sciences, people in arts and humanities, global politics, across the different schools at the university, to think about, well, what does it mean and how do we do it? And we know from research that just knowing things doesn't really sort of incite action. So what might we do in education? So I'm just going to start by a film. I don't know how many of you have seen The Zone of Interest, but I saw it a couple of weeks ago, and it's about the commandant of Auschwitz and him and his family who set up this little idyll really right next to the concentration camp. And all the time you sort of got a sense of it in the background, the sounds of it. It's a sort of film of today really, as much as the Second World War, and how in a way we all build this wall. And we're living with this wall all the time. It's you know, climate change, sustainability challenges are with us, and we feel it and we hear it, but at the same time, we just sort of carry on, or even those who are committed to change, you know, it's we still sort of have this wall. It's very hard to face and encounter all the time. And there's some interesting work on dark pedagogy, so sort of how do we engage with these issues coming through from Denmark, and drawing on the work of Sari, a philosopher who talks about the pedagogical imperative to bring encounters with what he calls abjects. So these are things that really challenge us, and the sorts of examples he gives us sort of dandruff and feces, so things that are otherwise, this challenge what otherwise feels quite stable, and it allows us sort of good sense self-identity. And Lisgard is talking about how this idea of abjects and the need to encounter them in education or in our lives is also pertinent to the Anthropocene, which, you know, we sort of carry on as normal because it disrupts us really fundamentally in terms of our own identities and the sort of possible social orders as well. So this is the sort of opus, you know, sort of how we continue our lives. So it's a real challenge educationally, but also not just educationally within schools, but in much more broadly than that, any potential educational context. So going back to World War II again, after World War II, many thinkers were concerned, well, how do we avoid genocide and global conflict? And Hannah Arendt was one of those thinkers, and she observed the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was the Nazi officer who was responsible for transporting Jews across Europe to different concentration camps. And what she concludes from observing his trial is actually that evil is banal. She talks about the banality of evil. And she says it's a remoteness from reality and a thoughtlessness that can wreak more havoc than all the evil instincts taken together. So she's talking about how Eichmann couldn't really encounter reality, and he couldn't think to shift what was happening, the norm, the social order. He obeyed the rules. In fact, his defense was he obeyed the rules. And if he'd been in another social order, he would have been heralded as a hero because he was very good at his job. But he just happened to be in a particular place at a particular time. And he wasn't really able to encounter that and think and challenge that order that he was within. And Donna Haraway, a contemporary philosopher, extends Arendt's work to think about the Anthropocene and how it too leads to genocides and speciesides. And her rallying call is that we must think, and think we must think. And so how do we do that? How do we think in the face of the Anthropocene? How do we encounter reality as Arendt and Haraway are evoking us to do? And one of the other challenges with the Anthropocene is the idea of it as a hyper object. So climate change being a hyper object. So we read about it in the media, we see it in the news repeatedly, but at the same time, it can still seem quite removed from our lives. Hyper objects are things that are massively distributed in time and space. And so they're so big that they're quite hard to sort of comprehend and to think about, to really encounter and think about. But at the same time, they're really known to us in the everyday of our lives, and they're embodied and sensorially experienced. And Morton talks about how the sun rains and burns down on our bodies. So the role then of pedagogues, educationists, but artists too, is to sort of surface this hyper object in our lives, and how we're enmeshed in it, so that we might encounter that reality and for that to become possible. Biesta is an educational philosopher who really informs the work of Rebecca and I, and he talks about, he's concerned with student freedom and how they might take up that freedom. And he says the educational gesture is to draw the attention of the student towards the world, to the reality of the world, if you like. And for the student to think, what what is demanded of them? What's their role in relation to the world? So he's saying the purpose of education is to make possible for the student to figure out how they, as an I, should relate to their own freedom and navigate their life in a world that's full of events and conditions that are not of their choosing. So how do we draw their attention to the world? And this is a picture. I teach on a forest food garden elective at the university, where students plan, design and plant a forest food garden full of sort of foods that can be eaten and medicinal plants as well. And there's a tension, somehow encountering plants, you realize you're not masterful of nature, that actually there's a lot beyond your control and beyond your choosing. And his question is really about demanding of students is what I desire desirable? And this is a question we really try and integrate into our teaching, and then when we're working with colleagues in other educational settings, how do we support students to ask that question? Is what I desire desirable for myself, for others, and for the planet on which we live, which arguably the planet is in such a mess because we've been projecting multiple desires of it that are unsustainable. But he also says that this isn't only the heart of education, it's also at the heart of sort of mental health work, where actually we're trying to keep young people in that difficult middle ground. The difficult middle ground between the multiple forces that are exerted on them, whether internally from the desires and the passions, or externally by all the desires that are sold to us, if you like, or the sort of drive to consume. And so how do we keep ourselves as teachers and pedagogues and artists, but also students and others in that difficult middle ground in a way that's bearable, but also demands attention and demands thinking. Thinking about what the situation of the world demands of each of us. And where our freedom comes into this is that it is a freedom to take it up that is uniquely our own, not one that is imposed by the teacher, but actually the student must work out what is demanded of them rather than being told what it is they must do. Because if we tell, we become authoritarian. As Hannah Arendt was suggesting with Eichmann, that just to instruct and just to tell becomes authoritarian. But what we need to create is a space where we can think and encounter reality and think deeply and think, what does it demand of me? And each student must come up with their own position in relation to that. And Tim Ingold is an anthropologist. He also evokes Hannah Arendt to think about how we engage in ecological issues. And Hannah Arendt says, do we love the generation enough, the next generation enough to take responsibility for it? And she's talking about how do we share what we love with the next generation, so that, and talking about how democracy always has to be reinvented by the next generation. So we share what we love and know of the world and feels we want to preserve of it, including democracy, but also to allow for the next generation to take it up in their own way. Again, not to impose what it is the next generation must do, but to share what we love and want to preserve about the world, so that they might then take it up in their own way. And of course, that includes sharing what we love and want to preserve about the cultural and the natural world, and including perhaps how they are enmeshed. And Ingold says that science alone doesn't teach us how to love the world. It's art that brings us to our senses, and art that rekindles wonder and astonishment. And that is art that enables us to learn how to attend directly, even lovingly, to the world. And to cultivate that sensitivity and wisdom. And that is what he says is ecological awareness. So if we want to encounter reality and we want to support others to think what that means and what it demands of them, so that they might uniquely come to their own position, art is really important and plays a really vital role in that. And as does storytelling as a form of art. And Amitav Ghosh, the novelist and writer, and he talks about the imperative really for us to engage with storytelling in the face of climate change and massive biodiversity loss, but not simply to have the sort of human protagonist, but also to include the non-human very much, that they speak. And in his own novels, they really do, play the sort of agency of the animal life is really evident. And in this is an image of Amaran Kutu, and he was sharing an ancestral story from the Quechua people in the Amazon with a group of students from primary and secondary schools and special schools that we organized in Stamina Park. And it's a story about the humanitarian coexistence between human and nature. And how the sort of nature is very foregrounded in the story, and the students were absolutely transfixed by the story. The agency of the story itself, if you like, was transfixing them. So, so hyperobjects, if we think about this expansive hyperobject that is massive in terms of its time and space, and actually how we're enmeshed in it and connected to it, also allows and evokes the feelings and emotions or affect, both in terms of our love for the world and drawing on Hannah Arendt's idea of sharing our love for the world. And here, this is work that we did with Alice Eldridge, who's also at Sussex, where the children were listening with really good sound technology to, I think this one is, so they're listening to insects in a compost bin, so that they can actually hear things that they couldn't hear without that technology. And then they started questioning, well, how do insects experience the world, and how might they experience their encounter with humans? Because if they stamped on the ground, you could hear all the vibrations. And so it started sort of generating lots and lots of questions. And Alice has got an installation in the Brighton Festival, Bird Bath. And we're working with her to involve children in creating sounds of birds as well. But similarly, there's grief, and there's sort of the inevitable grief of living within the Anthropocene. And this was just I was helping my daughter with her GCSE homework earlier this week and testing her on the impacts of climate change on Australia, and reading about the devastation that the fires led to in terms of killing just, unimaginable numbers of animals. And how that grief just, it really sat with me. It sort of impacted in my body. And it's a sort of daily encounter, isn't it? This, as we hear and read about the ongoing loss as a result of the crisis we're in. And we've got a PhD student, Tim Coxon, who's looking at this idea of grief and how do we bring grief into conversations within education. And he's looking at how do we bring sort of professionals whose life, the role is looking at bereavement and grief and bringing them into conversation with teachers. And actually how the sort of need for tender conversations, tender in terms that they're raw, painful, but also that need for care and tenderness to engage with this. And Gert Biester, the philosopher, he also draws a lot on the work of Jacques Rancière, the French philosopher who was interested both in politics and the politics of art and the politics of education as well. So we draw on his work too, and he's concerned about what it is to emancipate. But the emancipation is renouncing the authority of the imposed message, so that the artist or the teacher doesn't impose what it is that must be taken away. What is the message? To avoid that explication and to stop wanting to emancipate other people. So that his call is that freedom comes from one's self-emancipation, but not by being told what it is they need to be emancipated from. So here he didn't actually use this quote is from an article in Art Forum, and there was an illustration, but I'm afraid I don't know, I can't pronounce Sophie's surname here, but this artist, this wasn't actually the image, and I looked up other work, and this seemed to be one that conveyed a sense of the Anthropocene, but again, it's ambiguous. The image is ambiguous. We're not being sort of hammered on the head with what it is that we must take from this image. It invites us to come to our unique position and response in relation to this image. And this is what he's talking about as the imperative within both art, but also equally within education, so that we draw students or people's attention. Come, look at this. This is fascinating, look. And the invitation is to take it on oneself. I just want to quickly show a bit of a clip from Maria Lei's work, an Italian artist. Just going to show a minute of this.
Adesso questa trave deve dare il senso che è la traiettoria del vento. Devo fare in modo che chi vede l'opera, anche a distanza, sente che...
Okay, let me stop there. And I think for me, Rebecca and I, when we saw this work, we sort of, it really evoked for us the South Downs with the westerly winds and the slanting branches, and it tells us something about the climate, but also the power of sort of story and artwork to convey something of the natural world. But again, something that evokes a response uniquely from each of us in it. So I'm just trying to move on. And the bit I want to, so she talks about the connections between stories, knowledge and art, and how they were made early by Maria Ley. As a girl, she used to drop string on the ground and make up tales according to the pattern. But she struggled at school until her teacher, the writer, encouraged her to read purely for the rhythm of the writing. If meaning could be conveyed non-semantically, it could also be expressed through movement, objects, marks. She already saw how the non-written world could be read, the written word now opened up. And I think what we see is this connection between the pedagogue and the artist. And the pedagogue here is leaving open the possibilities here for Maria Ley through this just use of string that is not instructional or explicating what Maria should do, but it allows that possibility for her as the student to take up that, and it's quite transformative in its possibilities. So I'm just going to, I know I'm at my time, but very lastly, another educational ethnographer, he talks about the vertical and the horizontal. So the vertical is importance of working across generations. So we might think, what does Maria Ley teach us? What might she teach us? She died a couple of years ago, but someone is an older generation, but also those who came before, as she now does. And as well as looking ahead, the debt to those we owe to the yet unborn. But equally the horizontal, so working across difference, class, race, religion, gender, and the more than human, the non-human. And how that can bring us closer to a deep time of the world that predates and outlives the individual, something bigger, as the hyper-object conveys. And this is some work we did with young people with a partner agency in Ecuador, and young people were photographing things that mattered to them around sustainability issues. And just very lastly, just to draw your attention to this resource that we have. It's an open press, free access online resource of educational activities that include a lot of the creative as well. So thank you very much. I think I might have gone a bit over. I'm very sorry, Persephone.
Oh, you're exactly on time. Thank you so much, Perpetua. That was huge amount of information in there and so much to think about. I know that we didn't want to get to go too deeply into talking about this presentation solely, but if anyone's got any burning questions, perhaps one or two now, then we can take them. We're also thinking, does anybody have a burning question? And if you don't, there's an activity which is just for us to write or make notes or make meaning non-semantically for a few minutes before we move on to hearing from Maggie. Okay, well, in that case, if there's no burning questions, we've got 3 or 4 minutes just to journal, if you've got a notebook and a pen with you, just to think about anything you've taken away or want to explore when we do come to our group conversations after Maggie's presentation.
And if people don't have a pen or pencil, you could always pop something in the chat if that was a way you want to record what you're thinking and share it with people. So feel free to use the chat.
Okay, well, we're at 10:35 now, and so I'm going to hand over. I'm going to thank Perpetua from the bottom of my heart. That was amazing, and hand over to Polly to introduce Maggie.
Thanks, Percy. And yes, thanks, Perpetua. So many different thoughts buzzing around in my head.
We can keep adding to that chat, can't we? I guess maybe
yes, absolutely.
Be a bit of a stream of consciousness chat.
Absolutely. And I think there's actually a very nice flow from Perpetua on to our next speaker, who is Maggie Scott, who is a Hastings-based textile artist who makes works on many themes, including works around colonialism, around fast fashion, around identity. I first came across Maggie's work at an exhibition at the Hastings Contemporary Gallery last year. Time goes so quickly. Maggie's nodding, it was last year. And was really struck by it and by some of the talk-based events that went alongside it. And it was in a subsequent conversation that Maggie first raised this idea, this question of what is enough, which is such a simple question, but at the same time an incredibly complex and profound question. And every time I thought of it, I found myself thinking about it from a completely different viewpoint and angle, and it just really stayed with me. So when we were starting to think about the Cultural Assembly and the kind of things we wanted to explore, and also this event, bringing this question and Maggie and her perspective on it into the mix seemed like a really appropriate thing to do. So we're delighted that Maggie is joining us today from Hastings, and I will pass over to you, Maggie, to give us your presentation, and thank you.
Thanks, Polly. And hi, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here. And I'm also, let me just get rid of my image of myself here. It's a little bit overwhelming. I'm really delighted to have a chance to explore this question of what is enough. It's something I've been thinking about as a background thought for, I suppose, the last 5 years. So, as Polly mentioned, I'm a visual artist. I work primarily with textiles. I spent about 20 years as if you like, a commercial knitwear designer and weaver. And then the last 15 years, my work has been very much exhibition-based. My activism is intertwined with my art now, so there's no division. And I work on various topics that I feel passionate about, Black women and childbirth and many, many topics. And what I suppose motivates my work always, and I often talk about it, is that feeling you get in your gut when you just can't bear it any longer. And luckily, if you like, I have the possibility to get rid of that stuff. I can make a piece of work that speaks to that particular issue. So for the last 15 years, I've been doing that. And alongside that, I have been working in partnership actually with an organization called Address in Folkestone. And we have been doing workshops, presentations, subversive catwalks, primarily focusing on women, fashion, and climate justice, climate emergency. So many of our clothes now are made offshore. They're made in other countries. They're made primarily by women. So our workshops really, we used to explore the working conditions of women, what happens in those structures in the supply chain. And we got a chance to really investigate and get more information about what's actually happening on the ground. So that was fascinating and always useful, and also looking from my point of view at the global south, that relationship between the global north and the global south. But alongside that, since about 2007, I have been involved, created a project in Uganda. So for 10 years, traveling backwards and forwards to Uganda, a small village called Busiro, which is eastern Uganda, and it's one of the poorer counties. And there's a whole reason for that, but primarily if you don't vote for the president, you don't get any money and infrastructure. So Busiro is about 45 minutes from the nearest Tarmakadan road in a town called Magamaga. And in 2007, there is no electricity, no running water, and a very meager existence, let's say. Very basic crops, very confronting, actually, when you think of this question of what is enough. However, one of the things that always used to strike me there, and I would, I suppose, smile secretly, is that when we were having village meetings and sitting on the floor, quite often one of the women would rock up wearing a Laura Ashley, or, you know, just an extraordinary dress in the middle of the bush. Excuse me. And I became very interested. I was asking, well, you know, what's that about? How is it? And so I started visiting Kampala market, Kampala being the capital of Uganda, and is one of the largest importers of secondhand clothing. And I was astounded and really, I suppose, pleased actually to see that those things that we were recycling here, putting in our bins, taking to our secondhand stores, were arriving in enormous vats. Enormous trucks would come every Sunday. You would buy, sight unseen, one of these enormous, I mean, in fact, they're 1-ton sections. And then the market's divided into women, primarily women again, sitting on the floor. One will be specializing in underwear, another one will just have cardigans, another one will have children's wear. And into this market, local vendors would come in and buy a selection of clothes, which they would then take back either to their shop or, in the case of Busiro, a tiny shed, and they would sell the clothes on for a few Ugandan shillings. So consequently, Laura Ashley was arriving in Kampala and coming out to Busiro. And it was very impressive, that sort of ecosystem, problematic for local textile makers and stitchers, but I felt very chuffed. 10 years later, coming back to visit along the same road, through Mugga Mugga, suddenly seeing what I used to encounter, which is holding your nose because rubbish and plastic bags were being burnt in the little stream that surrounds that particular town, replaced entirely by clothing, t-shirts, all sorts of clothing, just a mountain of rubbished clothing. And I couldn't believe it, actually. I was really shocked. And so I started to put my nose a little bit into what was happening, you know, why, what had gone wrong, what had changed. Now, I'm sure everyone on this call is aware of recycling. We all try to do it. And indeed, it's fantastic, except that actually only 1%, it turns out, is actually recycled. Mainly because most of our clothes now are combinations of fibers. And in order to recycle a garment, those fibers need to be separated out and then respun, reformed. And there isn't, the bottom line is, it's time consuming and it's just too expensive. So only 1% actually gets recycled. The poorly ragged pieces that are given are made into insulation or into rags rather, and the rest, about 85% of it, gets sold on to the so-called developing world. Now, fine. However, the quality of that 85%, the quality of the clothing that's arriving is so poor now, is stained, is torn, is unusable, that it can't be resold. Now, taking you back to Busiro, this tiny, very small, under-resourced village, doesn't have trucks coming to drive along and recycle. Things get dumped. They get dumped into the stream, they get dumped into mountains of just rubbish, and there is no way to dispose of them. This was very concerning. Concerning because of what had changed in the structure and commerce on the ground, but also the consequences of having this amount of fabrics and clothing sitting on the land. So many of our clothes now are made of synthetic fibers, and I'm sure on this call we all know about that breaking down of plastics, how long it takes. I think polyester takes 200 years to break down. And so we are left with these microfibers that are ending up, as we know, in our food chain. So there's that. But it's also poisoning the water. It's poisoning the soil. So I wanted, it was one of those moments of what I say in my gut of driving me mad, really. And I felt compelled to try and say something about this or draw attention to this. So let me just share my screen because I have a few images that we can go through with that. Receiving these kinds of images was just shocking. It's the only way I can describe it. I was shocked, I was surprised, I really didn't know what to do. It turns out that the fashion industry produces 100 million tons. I'll just read that again, 100 million tons of waste a year. We, the consumer, are throwing away 2 million tons of textiles a year. Now, apart from being shocked or being numbed, it's like what to say, what to do, how to unpack all of this. What can I usefully, sitting here in Hastings, do about any of this? So when I got the opportunity, this is, by the way, a montage that I used in the exhibition. when I got an opportunity with Hastings Contemporary to be part of the We Out Here exhibition last year, and we were able to make whatever we wanted, that pain in my stomach, if you like, that anger, I thought I will channel it into here. And so what I produced was a very large lenticular. So on one side, you've got this montaged image of these, they're mountains, they're not even hills, huge, huge quantities of waste fabric and clothing being burnt, a huge, huge landscape. And juxtapose that with images of very happy women, because it's usually women that are targeted with fast fashion, young women in the global north shopping. And indeed, the piece was called Shopping, ? And it was a fantastic opportunity to just talk about the issue apart from anything else. Lots of discussions, as Polly mentioned, and wraparound events. I wanted to talk about what was going on, but I also wanted to draw attention to waste colonialism. In other words, the way in which one country or a group of countries use waste and pollution to dominate another group of countries in their homeland. And I think, in fact, it was a term coined in 1989 at the Basel Convention, when they were trying to regulate transboundary movements of hazardous waste. So it's not a made-up thing, it actually exists as a concept. And I wanted to talk or draw attention to waste colonialism. Now, I'm sure everybody by now must know about fast fashion, but I use it, it's a short term, it's a quick way of describing a whole set of issues. But the main thing about fast fashion is it's fast from catwalk to retailer. And we're talking really fast. You know, within a week and a half of something being shown on a catwalk somewhere, it will be on your high street. So it's fast to the retailer, but it's also fast to be disposed of. Fashion is the world's third largest industry after cars and electronics. It's the second most polluting industry in the world after oil. It is purported to emit 1.2 billion tons of CO2 every year. And more than that, it's one of the largest consumers of fresh water on the planet. Now, if you think that it's supposed to take around 2,500 litres of water just to make one single cotton t-shirt, you get to have a sense of the scale of the problem. Now, with current technologies, it would take about 12 years to recycle what fast fashion creates in 48 hours. The problem is enormous. Putting my nose into some of this and having workshops on some of this, and I could talk all day about what's going on. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, a bit of context, buying something in, say, 1950 would have cost you, so a dress would have been about £6, 48 pounds in current money. Now you can buy the same dress for £10 online. Bernardo's charity in 2019 found that British people will spend up to £2.7 billion on clothes during the summer that will only be worn once. We're producing 600 to 900 new styles every week, and it's predicted to rise by 60% by 2030. So we have to stop. It's not rocket science. Clearly, we have to stop. But why is that so hard? What gets in the way of us stopping buying, saying that's enough, and stopping this terrible cycle of production? So one of the things we did as a consequence, actually, of that shopping installation at Hastings Contemporary, we set up about 6 listening circles. And we found that that was a fabulous way to really try and unpack what we can do as individuals and share ideas about how to change things. So because female consumers in the global north have always been the focus of the fashion industry, we looked at sexism and objectification that affects women's self-esteem and our body image. We're basically made to feel bad about ourselves and then sold items that will make us feel better. We looked at confidence and how that's intertwined with fashion and the motivations to keep buying. And then finally, we did quite a lot of sessions and work on how to reach women who were targeted, particularly targeted by fast fashion advertising. And we worked on classism, our class background, and our current relationships to buying clothes. Now, working on class gave us another important key, if you like, to this overconsumption. And that's, I suppose, something I want to offer on this call in terms of looking at what is enough. Those early messages we receive in our families, our homes, our communities have a considerable impact on what we feel we need and what we need and want now. Just like working on our internalized sexism and those messages that say, we're not okay, and if we just buy that dress, those shoes, that coat, we'll feel better. Looking at those early messages around what exactly were we told about consuming that make us still vulnerable to persuasion now. I can give a really clear example when I was working on it. So I'm clearly now living a middle-class life and have done for some time. But I was raised in a working-class, immigrant, poor family. And one of the issues in that family was just about resource, looking for bargains, looking for cheap options, getting by. And that message has remained with me. It's become part of the way in which I would consume things. I am the queen of looking for bargains online, whatever it is. I have that facility. It's still running. And so identifying that was really useful and very helpful when it came to thinking about what is enough. Do I need this? Can I stop? Now, with clothes, it's relatively easy. If you do a bit of work, if you do a bit of investigation, you find out how many liters of water it takes to make a pair of jeans, for example. It's quite easy to stop buying jeans. But it's a little more confronting and challenging if you apply that question of what is enough to other resources. I can see the time ticking. I'm almost finished. Now, the impact of climate change in the global south is already evident. I think we're all agreed. But in the global north, it looks like the ability, the reaction to the lack of resources is going to be a huge problem that we're going to have to face. If we're lucky enough here in the UK, here in the global north, to escape the direct impacts of catastrophic changes in temperature in the global south, crops damaged by extreme weather events far away mean price rises and shortages here. For example, in the UK, we import around 50% of our food. Surprisingly, 70 to 80% of our fruit and vegetables are brought in. If things keep going the way they are, it's predicted that as many as 1.5 billion more people, that's 5 billion in total, are likely to face shortages of food and clean water, particularly, of course, those who will be hit first in Africa and Southern Asia. But if current estimates are correct, and I did look this up about 4 days ago, hundreds of thousands of people in England will be at risk of severe flooding. A quarter of all farmland in England and Wales will only support the growing of grass for most of the years. In the next 20 years, we're going to need an increase of 1 billion litres of water, just here in England. The risk of civil unrest and social collapse is expected to increase dramatically. So, what is enough food? What is enough water? What is a tolerable amount for you? What is enough, more importantly, so that you can share? Because clearly we need to find a way to unite, but with this collapsing society, we need to be able to share. So I think figuring out what is enough is now more than ever a crucial piece of work for us all to do. It's about survival solidarity. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Maggie. Again, huge food for thought. And that connection to one of the quotes from Perpetua's talk, "Is what I desire desirable?" seemed to me to really connect through to what you were saying about some of those very long-held ideas about what I need, that link between need and desire. So yes, thank you very, very much. As Percy said before, we are going to take a bit of time to go into breakouts and talk about both what we've heard from both presenters together. But if there were any burning questions for Maggie that people needed to ask before we do that, there is an opportunity to do that. So if anyone does have a direct question that they'd like to ask, we are going to come back together and have a discussion. So there'll be time to address things to the non-presenters then as well.
I'm just reading to see if there are any notes in the comments that I can respond to.
I think when we start talking about this together, I think some of this stuff is going to.
I hope so. I'd love to have a discussion, a further discussion about what's enough.
So, weaving change. Nice. So we are going to go into breakouts. I know that a few of you have your cameras off. You might be doing other things. If you are able to take part in the conversations, that's fantastic. But I appreciate that some people might not be able to. Percy, we've got a few minutes. Yeah, we've got a few minutes now. That if people want to share back any of what they've been talking about, or bring anything new into the conversation, or reflect at all on the presentations, now is our chance to do that. And also, we're particularly interested in how some of these reflections can be threads that we can draw into the assembly on the 22nd, and represent some of what was shared here today in some of the conversations that might happen on the 22nd in Bexhill. So,
and just to say on that note, because those that are organising the cultural assembly, we were all sitting in on those breakout rooms, so we've all taken notes and can find a way to kind of, you know, bring that into the conversation at the cultural assembly. I guess it's just timing today is quite short in terms of the process of doing that. So I guess they have been captured in one way.
And the chat, please do keep on putting things in the chat, because that's a really easy way of us to pull some of these thoughts and some of these reflections into
Amy, sorry to jump in, Polly, but Amy was just literally about to have her
and then it stopped. I mean, I'm happy. Yeah, I'm happy just to kind of share. I think a couple of things that we were talking about. It was actually really wonderful to hear the presentations and then to come back and hear some of that reflective response. I think one of the things is the reminding. When we are reminded through actually the power of imagery, there is, I guess for me, there is something that I kind of just wanted to say to the group in terms of care. I can feel what's happening in my body as a result of that. And I think there is sometimes a really quick response of just kind of getting back into things really quickly. And I think just spending a bit of time, I think just as a collective group that have come here today, just to sit with, even if it's 5-10 minutes of what's kind of come up in the call, can be helpful, you know, in just processing, because it's, you know, it's big stuff. I was very moved, I think, through what felt like a very personal account, Maggie. Felt very visceral. So just, I guess that was one of the things. And then just another thing, just really felt important, was just around, we have a lot of dominant narratives. And I think the question around rewriting those narratives. So yeah, that's all for me. But thank you, Maggie.
I mean, just as a direct kind of follow on in a way from that, when the quote, Perpetua, one of the quotes that you shared about science doesn't teach us to love the world, and art rekindles wonder. Having spent a whole career in the arts, I'm actually currently working more with science. I'm working at Kew at the moment. Lovely to see some of my Kew colleagues here. And it just made me wonder if actually, and this did also kind of come up in Maggie's presentation, that there is something about changing your view, changing your perspective, which just kind of reignites, be it wonder, or reignites your questioning of the world. Because certainly the science lens that I've had for the last few months has reignited all sorts of things for me, in a way that art has also done at different points. But I think there's just been something about changing that perspective, changing the lens that you view things on. That could be because you go to a different country. That could be because you listen to a different experience. It could be what you look at. I think we get so set in a particular way of encountering the world, and the dominant narratives that we carry around with us, as you said, Amy, that, yeah, changing maybe some of that thinking that we have to do, that Perpetua mentioned, starts with changing the view that we have of things. Are there any other reflections that anyone would like to share?
I'd like to just add in, I was kind of conscious of this idea of sustainability as like a massive, we call it a hyper object. And it just is like, it's so meaningless because it's just massive. You know, what does that mean? It means everything, doesn't it? So I think kind of, you know, the kinds of things that we were talking about, it's all so big, and it's capitalists, and it's middle class people flying everywhere and having big cars and all that kind of stuff. So how do you kind of bring it down, you know, bring it down to, you know, kind of things that you can do, you know? So I've been doing performance work, outdoor performances, which reach the largest audiences, all about encouraging people to ride bicycles. You know, we're doing a project about women in cycling at the moment, looking back at the history in order to look forward. And as that's evolved, there's now sort of, we're linking into active travel organisations and cycling organisations across the region. We're doing workshops to encourage people remake clothing, because that's what happened in the 1880s, 1890s. Women remade clothing. We're just kind of evolving all these ideas around this simple idea of, you know, it started with just getting people to think about cycling, you know, discovering the joy in cycling, and all this other stuff's come into it. So I think it's like, find one thing, you know, if it's water, if it's clothes, I don't know, and just kind of follow it. But my view is it's about doing what you can to, you know, it's about community engagement. You have to reach into communities, talk to people where they are, and then see what happens.
Thanks, Aaron. And yeah, I think what you do with cycling is you're bringing something positive, the positive act of cycling rather than the negative act of don't drive. It's cycle. Cycle's great.
Exactly.
Pippa, you had your.
I was just going to lead on from you, Polly, and just say that I think that one of the things that we've said in the group that I think is interesting about that sort of how do you re-see things or you know, make change, and that actually to go back to the actual creative practice that then is the way in which we, in our own work, as you know, if we're artists and arts professionals, we use the creative practice in order to see things differently, and for that to be leading rather than the kind of content of the work being about climate change, because that's what's going to help everybody. And just on from Karen, I mean, I completely agree, and then I would just add to it that to do that locally, to do it where you are, which obviously reinforces the whole way in which CBE has managed itself and trying to be more focused where we are.
Victoria.
Yeah, I think picking up on what Pippa said and some of the things that we were saying is thinking about artistic process, and it's the process that's important rather than the manufacture of the speculative object at the end of it, and that needs to be held somehow in sort of artistic practice, particularly in relation to, you know, art made in the emergency related to ecology and the environment. Anyway, we had a long conversation about that, but that was the summary.
Any other reflections in our last few minutes?
How do you express the joy of living simply? There's a story to be told of being, you know, lured away from the simple life, which is pretty much our origins, into this ridiculous life of chasing nonsense and rubbish and getting cluttered up with insane mental concerns. And the stories of liberation, joining back into our harmony with the natural world and with each other, with a real simple light step on the earth.
Yes, nodding there.
How do you make it attractive? It's not a message I see spread. I mean, but the people that pay the most to make you feel inadequate with your lifestyle, that you need to have rubbish. But how do you express it in such a way that people actually see the joy and feel the joy and want to join in and let go of, relinquish the nonsense?
How is it? A lot of the most powerful artwork I've seen around this subject has done that in some way. It has shortcutted or cut short that kind of, all of those habitual ways of thinking and just reconnected you directly to the joy of something. And joy, as we know, is a hugely powerful thing. It's always stayed with me from my first ever Culture Declares session, that the idea of joy as a radical force. And if we can connect people to joy as a way of unlocking agency. Perpetua.
I think it's a really great question, and I think there's something about the sort of decentering of the I, of the human, and actually inviting us to think, and well, in our work in education is about trying to encourage students to encounter what is other, whether that's a plant or a person or whatever it is, or an idea, and actually thinking, what does it demand of us, rather than starting from what it is we desire. So it's the I is still very much in that because it demands a response, but it's actually a shift in focus. And we've had this sort of humanist focus on the I, and it's trying to shift a bit away from that. So I think it's sort of drawing attention to what is other, and then thinking, what does that demand of me, rather than what do I want from it, which is the sort of extractive stance. And that does, it had the potential to focus on the simpler, if you like, as well. So yeah, so it's sort of, and that's the educational endeavor, I think, but it's not easy. There are many competing demands on attention in what Herb Yester calls the impulse society.
We are on 11:29. So unless there are any final points anyone wants to make, I was just going to ask Amy to repost the Eventbrite link at the bottom of
Done that.
that. Yeah.
What about Amy giving it, hyping up the cultural assembly a little bit?
Yeah.
And also to say we've got artist bursaries for travel.
Yep, we do have artist bursaries for travel. So it's yeah, we've set aside £25, and there's a limited number to about 30 of those bursaries available. So please do let us know through the Eventbrite link if that's something you'd like to take make use of, and please do. Yeah, just, I mean, you know, these conversations are so rich and important, and from a regional perspective, you know, bringing those kind of connections and glue those relationships, you know, knowing each other as people is really, really important. You know, the Cultural Assembly will attempt to bring us together, you know, in, you know, the first time we're doing this from a regional point of view in terms of an assembly, but it really is just a starting point and an opportunity to come together. So just, it's a day where we are trying to put the, you know, kind of creativity at the heart of what we're, you know, trying to plan through the day. We are really thinking through care and how to do an event which really considers that, given the kind of, you know, given what we bring of ourselves into these discussions and how we want to kind of nurture through the day. So all of that is kind of built into the day. And as much as anything, there is also an opportunity at the end to reflect upon that process and for you to kind of give that feedback. So just do come along, you know, send it out to people, that you think would also benefit from it. So yeah, aware of time. So yeah.
Yes. And a big thank you to the University of Sussex and the Delaware Pavilion who've provided support to make the event happen. And I'm sorry for those of you who are here who are not in the Southeast. I'm not sure, we're going to look at whether we can capture any of the day, but I'm not sure we've got the resources to do a full capture of the day, but we'll see what we can do. Thank you. As Victoria said, please look out for the offer. That they come, we try and offer them regularly. If you're not on the Culture Declares mailing list, please go to our website. You can sign up for the newsletter. Information about all Culture Declares events comes out through that. If you're near a hub, please get involved in it. If you're not, please start one, because this kind of local conversation is the engine of Culture Declares, and that's where this thinking and this action really takes shape, and it's a brilliant thing to be part of. Thanks everybody, really brilliant to see you. Thank you Perpetua, thank you Maggie, and I hope to see some of you on the 22nd, if not see you in a box on Zoom sometime soon. Thank you.